What would need to happen for you to finally try at least Final Fantasy re, um, remake series?
There's just something about it that just it does not click for me anymore.
All right, everyone. Hey, this is Chris here and Andrew, Ninja To Viaduct, back here again. And, today we are going to try something a little bit new today, a different kind of topic, and maybe hopefully it'll be interesting to you all that are watching today. But tonight, we are doing a little bit of a one-on-one between me and Andrew, my brother here. And, both of us, we've been playing games together for as long as we've been alive together. And there's a lot of commonalities between us in terms of what we play, what we have played together. But we also have some differences that between us, interests and insights and thoughts, opinions about games, entertainment that's out there. And I thought, what do I maybe not know about my brother and what his takes are about the world of gaming entertainment? So today, it's just gonna be me and Andrew, and where I'm gonna be asking some questions to Andrew and see what else I can learn more. Maybe I'll be surprised. Maybe I won't. Maybe I will predict what he has said. But that's what we're gonna find out today. So hopefully this will be all something interesting to you. So Andrew, you and I, like I mentioned, we've been playing games for, as early as back as the early Super Nintendo Duck Hunt. I remember that. Super Mario, playing that 2D slider and so forth. But let's start easy. What's the most memorable earliest part in gaming that you remember in our life?
So for me, I think the earliest game that I can very vividly remember was playing Super Mario Bros. On the Nintendo console. Um, it's all a little spotty, but that's the earliest memory I have of any type of interaction with game. After that, it kind of just like jumps with like various types of flashbacks. I mean, there was us hanging out at our cousin's place. That was our introduction to things like Metal Gear, the N64 and GoldenEye, Smash Bros, things like that, and Final Fantasy as well. And so we had some of those early introductions, but didn't necessarily have the console for it ourselves until sometime later, where we got our own PlayStation 1. And that's where I really started to get a lot of these core memories where, there was just us playing things like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro. There was a fighting game at the time that we were playing. I don't even know how we ended up getting this, but it was called like Battle Arena Toshington. Um, yeah, and it was just like an odd cast of characters, but still like a pretty enjoyable run. But yeah, those are some of my early memories with video games. And then, of course, we have things like handhelds and stuff as well. I think like an early core handheld memory I had was prior to Pokemon Blue. We had like a Bomberman game and a Donkey Kong game, and I remember playing that pretty regularly on the Game Boy.
I'm kind of curious. When do you think at some point did it start clicking for you, like having like a real awareness, comprehension as to like what you were playing? Like I remember for myself playing games back then. Where I remember playing a game. Yes, I get that, right? Like when we were that young, we all knew we were playing a game. But I think there was a certain point where I realized I was playing something like with a story, right? Really playing something that had emotion or like something that was more, right? You ever had a moment like that, or like a certain point where you realize that, yeah, I'm actually playing something that's actually more than just, a pixels on the screen, anything like that?
Yeah, I think that came um, for me a little bit later on within like I guess the timeline for games as a whole. Like, I at a young age I was playing a lot of these very heavy story driven games, but I just didn't necessarily comprehend it. Like I remember in our first recording, you had mentioned like Final Fantasy VII, right? And that was like a big moment for you. And I played through that. Like, after you beat all of these things, I did my own run. I like, you know, almost 100%ed all of these games as well. But I still didn't necessarily comprehend what exactly it was I was playing. And it wasn't until I think like, I don't know, 2001, 2002 or something, when Knights of the Old Republic came out. And that was my first like narrative driven game that one I also really felt like I was role playing. Like all the decisions were me. I wasn't necessarily following someone else's story and like kind of seeing the world through their eyes. Like every decision was on me, and so that's where I started to get hooked on some things. And then when it was sort of the big reveal in that game of what that twist was, that was when I was just like, oh man, this feels different. And that's when I started to really look at games in a completely different light. I went back and started looking and examining at all of these other games that I had played in the past, and really started to approach them not as just like forms of entertainment and like things I want to do or like to pass the time, or that it was like cool, right? But that these were in fact like works of art, and to really try to appreciate them as such, both on a technical standpoint, visually, mechanically, but also very much so with the narrative as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I definitely agree that games are definitely a form of art, a very technical form of art too. It's not something where you just have like a canvas and a colors and a paintbrush kind of thing. Not that traditional way of art is any better or worse than gaming is, but it is much different, and it is interesting to see how games have become what they are. I mean, as art, you know, as core entertainment, but then becoming things like art, having a story, and even something that's comparable to a Hollywood film. Now, with that said, I mean, the video game industry we all know is relatively young compared to the other industries, entertainment industries, whether that's like traditional art or film and music and so forth like that, right? But there are some comments out there where for people, for example, people in the filmmaking industry, right? They, you've seen some criticisms about like some famous Hollywood directors, right? Um, Feeling that video games is a inferior platform to convey art, to convey a story. I mean, like, what's your take on that? I mean, you've seen it, every once in a while, right? I mean, yeah, but what's your take on that criticism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's misguided. It comes from a place that is from someone who doesn't necessarily understand games, right? Or has tried to experience these moments. And it sometimes takes a while, right? Because like even for us, in the story that I just told, like I played all these very heavy story driven games, but like I really didn't come to understand them until a little bit later in life. I mean, granted I was a child, um but it does take the right game to really hook some people in. Now, I do think, especially as time has gone on, there are some universally accepted games as like this is considered like an art piece or like some type of narrative work that you may want to try to embrace and try to experience or try to show other people out there of like this is not just like a toy or like a pastime. Like this truly is a work of art. And I think within that stratosphere, you have things like Bioshock, you have things like Mass Effect, you have the Final Fantasy games as well to a certain degree. I do think where Final Fantasy is, it is a little blown out of proportion, but we can get into that a little bit later on. Um, but you have things like The Last of Us, and I think given the past year, 2 years or so, where we're starting to see the gaming world or different worlds in games come and change mediums to go into television or movies. I think games are finally starting to get that recognition. It's still early on, but I think we're finally starting to accept on a much larger scale that games truly are a work of art, and I would argue to say a superior form of entertainment.
For sure, for sure. I mean, I think I would say if there's any one game maker that's making a point to elevate or present video games as a well, specifically a kind of a film or equivalent to film, is Hideo Kojima. I mean, you see his games. I mean, Metal Gear. You can see from the very beginning, Metal Gear, the way he was making Metal Gear 1, 2, 3, 4, each increment, it was slowly becoming more cinematic, right? And then he and Metal Gear was a Metal Gear Solid 5. He used Keith Sutherland's as the voice for Solid Snake. Getting rid of David Hayter for whatever reason. Although I really like David Hayter's voice for Snake. And you look at Death Stranding, right? Recently, I mean, I actually haven't played Death Stranding, although I find the premise interesting. Although hearing that the game is a walking simulator is a bit of a turnoff for me. But the fact that he is making a point to use legit actors like Norman Reedus. I think the other actress is Margaret Qualley. Maybe I'm pronouncing her name wrong, but there's some other characters, actors too. He's using Death Stranding that are you can consider high profile or relatively prof or at least well known, right? They're not people that you would not have seen before, and he's using them as using the faces even as actors and voicing characters. So and adding to the fact that when you play one of Hideo Kojima's games, I mean, it's not uncommon to see a game where you have like cutscenes that are like 15, 20, 30 minutes long, and maybe the gameplay is a lot less. So you got to give Hideo Kojima credit that he is trying to bring a game into a more elevated, or bring more awareness as to it being a comparable, if not like you said, a superior form of entertainment. And yeah, I would imagine it is superior in storytelling, right? I mean, like as an audience, you're playing a game, you're getting a story, you're getting crazy, great acting, great music, but you're also in the game, right? Your actions are, um, affecting the game, the story that's going along the way. So I mean, it definitely make you think. You make a great point that. So another slight going a bit tangent then, but so what would you say is right now a problem with gaming and entertainment right now?
Uh, I think there's a bunch, but a lot of it, separating the art element itself. I do think one of gaming's biggest issues has to do with things happening on the back end, right? Things going on with like the studios and where different resources are being dialed in on, and when you hear some of these stories where like studios are being shut down or layoffs are happening, a lot of these decisions are made seemingly through like an analytical lens, right? Where we are investing, less in new IPs or new stories and focusing in on like online battle passes or cosmetics and stuff. And while some of these story-driven games or like experimental games are cool and exciting, they ultimately don't make the kind of money that these studios are looking for, right? When you hear some things on like transactions. These studios are making like hand over fist money, and so I think that it It's definitely a complicated situation. I do think a lot of it can be tied to this sort of like capitalistic mindset of like unending growth, or like this drive to achieve unending growth. And I do think that that needs to be a deeper conversation that has to be had, not just with these studios, although definitely there, but with the consumers themselves, with gamers themselves. Um, but I do think that is probably the most pressing issue at the moment. And until we can really address that, some of these other elements seem, I don't know, somewhat less important in a way. Um, Taking a different glance at it, though, I do think one of the kind of more recent issues that we're seeing, and it is slightly changing, is trying to have different gaming IPs, or just games in general, appeal to a larger audience. And so we're seeing that with the transition to television, to films. And while we've had a couple of wins so far in the past few years with things like Last of Us, as well as Fallout, and I would even go as far as say like the Sonic movies and Twisted Metal, we do have some misses like the Halo series that came out.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's been effort. I'm with that, right? And there are shows out there. Like, you gotta give Amazon credit, right? When they made Fallout, I mean, of course, there is always a risk that when you have a adaptation of a game to be live action, that it's not going to turn out well. Like you mentioned, Halo. But Amazon is probably the in terms of being able to provide high quality television, um, kind of in mirror of like what like HBO is in terms of like prestige TV. You give Amazon credit that they are seemingly, putting money where the mouth is, and creating a legit quality, high quality adaptation of video games. So Fallout being one of them. Um, I know you were talking to me a lot about looking forward to Amazon's work on the Mass Effect shows coming out, and which I'm personally looking forward to. I mean, I love Mass Effect. I know you love Mass Effect. I mean, we're all always in for a good space opera, and there's a lot of material I imagine that could be used to make a live action show that I think is would be widely enjoyable to a mass audience. I mean, I could say Fallout maybe is a bit of a niche to a certain extent, I think. But I think Mass Effect is not so hardcore sci-fi where it would alienate people, especially I guess given the kind of action that you expect from Mass Effect. So yeah, I mean, there we know there's some good work that's being made to kind of push that push that forward. Okay, so I want to ask, is there any game studio, publisher, game franchise that you currently have a gripe on right now? Because I know we've been talking a lot about video games and how they are great, and all the good points about it, and how they're being elevated and being moved forward into a even better medium. But I mean, I knowing you, I do know you have some hot takes on certain things. So yeah, any type of game studio, game franchise that you have gripe about.
So I wouldn't say I have any right now. I mean, there you can definitely critique just about any game studio out there, but I wouldn't say I have an axe to grind with any one particular studio nowadays. Now, in my youth, that wasn't necessarily the case. I for a long time I did have an axe to grind with Square Enix. Growing up, we played a bunch of different Square Enix games, Square Soft games, and it was all well and good. But at a certain point, I just sort of had this epiphany moment where I realized these games were just not all that it was hyped up to be. And I remember it specifically, it was when I was playing Final Fantasy 12. And up until this point, I had started to play different types of games out there, and it just sort of dawned on me, like, the thing that everybody loved about the Final Fantasy games and SquareSoft games and Square Enix games is the story, right? And for me at that time, just the story wasn't really hitting right. And I even started to reflect on some of the previous games I played, and I was like, oh, these were fine, and there are definitely moments in time, but if you were to sort of like break it down, I don't think they're really as good as this sort of like mysticism is, that surrounds a lot of Square Enix games. And on top of that, I do think when all of this was happening, it was, we were sort of hitting this low point just in general for Square Enix. They're just consistently after that point, their games I think weren't really doing particularly well in terms of like ratings and scores and reviews and such. And I felt that a lot of the stories were pretty stale at the time. There's I don't know how to sort of phrase this in an academic way, but at that point in our lives, we consumed a great deal of Japanese media, anime, dramas, books, things like that, and there is a certain type of style that is pretty consistent across these things. There's a certain level of overacting, melodrama, and it all started to get a little stale at the time. And then when I started playing these games where it really forces you to be even more invested in it than any of these other mediums would, that staleness became particularly clear to me at that time. And so it was around then that I just decided, what, I don't think I'm going to be playing Square Enix games anytime soon. I think the only thing I was willing to make an exception on was something like Kingdom Hearts 3, right? Which was like rumored forever, and we were getting like little teases here or there. But then that had a, development cycle of, I don't know, when did Kingdom Hearts 2 come out? Like 05, 06 or something. And then Kingdom
Something
Hearts
like
3
that.
came out in like 2018, 2019 or something.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
I just felt that was sort of ridiculous. And even I know they were continuing to release things building up to the Kingdom Hearts story, but even then, if you really just sort of look at that timeline and break it all down, it's a ridiculous story, and I just like couldn't deal with it anymore. So yeah, that was, if I were to choose a studio, that would be the one that I kind of had an axe to grind with. But over time, I just kind of came to realize, hey, this is not really for me, or not really for me anymore, and that's fine. And yeah, I've sort of just mellowed with age when it comes to these game studios.
for sure, for sure. I mean, yeah, I admit that for Square Enix did have a moment. I think a lot of it too could have been the at least in the beginning, maybe early 2000s, so forth. I think my opinion is Square Enix was a victim of a bit of its the fact that it was a Japanese company. I mean, so one thing I do know about Japanese companies, at least traditional Japanese companies, is that it is a bit unique compared to the Western side, like America, right? You have kind of a corporate culture where it's like you are voicing your opinion individualistically, right? Maybe you're one employee, two employee, you're in a team, and you all are trying to spit out ideas and be the voice to be heard when making a decision in the business, right? Whereas, as a Square Enix being a Japanese company, there was a bit of mentality where it's you got to get some kind of consensus and maybe have one person or two people kind of making their shots and kind of getting everyone kind of falling in line with that thinking. And some story about some infighting between different departments at Square Enix back in the day. So I definitely think that that whole melodramatic, especially Kingdom Hearts being that franchise that's just like so convoluted. I think that probably was a victim where you had one guy, I think it was Tetsuya Nomura, I think, I think his name was, were dictating the story, and I give credit that they've been able to make a story that long with Kingdom Hearts, uh, but definitely way, in my opinion, way too complex than it should be. I mean, it's like it's like this twister after twister after twister, and yeah, Kingdom Hearts 3, um, it came out so long, and what the worst part about Kingdom Hearts 3 is, I do generally enjoy playing Kingdom Hearts 3. I mean, it was fun. It was Kingdom Hearts game, Disney stuff, that good stuff. But when I played the game from start to end, I felt that it was just a okay game. After all that hype, especially being a main number Kingdom Hearts game, it was only just okay. I didn't hate it, but I didn't like it either. So it's so I understand where you're coming from, where you say that Square Enix is maybe a shining example, at least back then, a shining example of what maybe was not the best thing to do. But I heard you say that maybe now Square Enix is maybe recovering. I mean, like, what's your take on that?
I mean, it seems like they're kind of on the right track nowadays to a certain degree, right? I haven't played any of these games, but I still keep up with them, right? Like I watch different streams, I read synopsis, I watch full video playthroughs of like just the main story bits of these various Square Enix games, the um, remaster of the Final Fantasy series, or like Final Fantasy 7, some bits of like Final Fantasy 14, even with Kingdom Hearts 3, and some of it seems cool, but I think some of my gripes with the Square Enix games from the past, they're still there. There is a certain level of melodrama that's pretty consistent with a lot of forms of like Japanese entertainment, which is totally fine if that's for you. It's really just doesn't necessarily click for me anymore. Um, but yeah, I think those are kind of my main things with Square Enix. Uh, you know, taking a step away from their sort of like main studio, Square Enix has sort of evolved and has picked up a number of different types of studios out there. I mean, I think the Deus Ex series was tied to Square Enix, if
Yeah.
I'm not mistaken. You also have like the recent Tomb Raider series. They technically got picked up by Square Enix as well, right? And so they're developing some cool things there. But I think in terms of like the main line Square Enix studio that most people will think of when it comes to like a lot of these Japanese games and like the Final Fantasy series, that type of stuff is just really not for me. I really haven't touched a new Final Fantasy game in a very long time.
Sure, for sure, for sure. I mean, I think I would. I'm thinking that they are, at least today, they are getting more aware of the fact that they have to change. And I think a shining example of that is with Final Fantasy 16. Like for Final Fantasy 16, it's a main number Final Fantasy game that's very different from the traditional JRPG. Like in fact, it's not even a JRPG. I argue it is a definitely more westernized action RPG, and a really well made action RPG too. Which I played from the very beginning. I played all the expansions. Very much liked it, and when I played the game, I had very. I mean, there's still some of it. There's still some of like kind of like that Japanese anime, drama, melodrama in there, but I definitely did not feel it as much, say, compared to playing Final Fantasy 7. Like, so I played Final Fantasy 7 Remake and Rebirth and Final Fantasy 16, and to me, I can tell they're very different games in terms of like the story style. Like for Final Fantasy 7, you're still getting that typical Japanese cutesy is melodrama of Final Fantasy 7. Which is still very enjoyable. I like it, but it's still distinctly Japanese, right? Whereas you play Final Fantasy 16, it is definitely. I mean, it's clearly Western influence by in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, E's comparison is a bit of a Game of Thrones kind of a style. Like I couldn't stop thinking that this is something I could see if they made a Final Fantasy game into a bit of like an HBO prestige kind of TV, right? So I can see that, and I give Square Enix credit for making that change, especially for a headlight game where it's a big risk to do something entirely different. Now I don't know what the numbers are. I think from what I know, there hasn't been official hard numbers released other than just Square Enix announcing on their, I guess, like financial meeting, saying that Final Fantasy 7 remake, rebirth, and Final Fantasy 16 didn't sell to the expectations. It isn't. They didn't say it sold bad, but it just didn't sell as high as they want, which is an entirely different thing. But I mean, granted that they're a company that's a corporation, right? They're trying to make money, right? But still take that risk. I give them credit for that. I've read some articles, interviews from some of the main game developers, right? The producers, also acknowledging that, they are getting older, and they are thinking that eventually it's time for them to let younger people, newer people, to spearhead some of the future of their headline games, Final Fantasy games, for example. So, with that awareness, and the attempt to change a little bit. So yeah, I'm hopeful that they will bring some new 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 flair, new blood into Final Fantasy. Not that I don't enjoy what they've been making so far. Like I think I pretty much played almost every Final Fantasy game, for example, except for Final Fantasy. I think it was 11, the online game. Um, but otherwise, I still enjoy it. But yeah, I am curious to see what they do going forward. So there's something I heard you said where you were feeling that Square Enix's mainstream games maybe are not for you anymore. Like I guess like a traditional Final Fantasy game, you know. And I know I've been trying to get you to play Final Fantasy 7 remake and rebirth, you know. But what would need to happen to for you to finally try at least Final Fantasy re, remake series?
Honestly, I don't think there's anything that would make me want to try those games. Like I just there's a lot about it that I just look at artistically, right? Just from the visuals, from the story. I don't know. There's just something about it that just it does not click for me anymore. And every time, the only times I ever really consider like, am I going to try this now? Is when I'm in just sort of like a dry spell of games and I've like beaten everything that I possibly could think of at that point, and then I just look at my catalog and think, what haven't I played yet? And Final Fantasy pops up pretty regularly, but I just cannot bring myself to ever really come back to that. It's part of it might just be that it's soured now, and I can't, deep down I can't let that go. But I don't know. It's just my palate has changed. That's it. I do find myself going back quite often to these earlier games. So, I have given the original Final Fantasy a try. I've gone back to Final Fantasy 8. I really want to go back to Final Fantasy 9. Um, and possibly if those were ever remade, I may consider it as well, just because I do hold those a little bit in higher regard than I ever did for Final Fantasy 7. Even way back when, during peak Final Fantasy 7 or Final Fantasy 7. One thing that I do come back on a pretty regular basis, though, is Final Fantasy Tactics. Though I do think this was a Final Fantasy that, at the time, was very different as well. Both in terms of its mechanics, its visuals, but also in its story as well. And we played this, back in the day. We were renting it from Blockbuster, And I was like way too young to really understand what exactly this story was. But even then, I knew it for whatever reason. It had its hooks in me, and I the moment it was released on PSP, picked it up immediately, played through it, beat the whole thing in one go, and you know over time I picked it up again for mobile. Right, same thing. Played through it, tried to 100% that game, and that is just one of those stories that I can always kind of go back to, and I think it's something that Square Enix really should consider looking back on and trying to remaster and re-release, just because I do think it did have that sort of like Game of Thrones vibe to it. There was sort of this waging factions of like royal families, a lot of like politics involved with it, conversation about social class, while still having this sort of air of mysticism and mystery that was going on. And yeah, I do think it's one of those gems that Square Enix just has not been able to fully utilize just yet. And I do think if they were able to put some time into it and re-release it today in a more modern setting, or just building out that story even further, because I do think even where the game ends, there's still a lot of fascinating aspects to that world that they could build upon.
Okay, so what would be your just one game? What it would be the best modern game you've played right now?
Best modern game, I think it has to be Elden Ring, which is
Okay.
kind of funny because it's also a game that has very little story in it, right? Or rather, like it's a game where you can totally play through and there's maybe only like 10 minutes worth of any like voiceover dialogue. But there's the way it was all crafted and written, there's a lot of lore just like within the text itself as you're kind of reading through some of these things, as you sort of take a deeper dive into some of these singular lines that these NPCs are giving you, and you kind of piece it all together. The story is incredibly fascinating, incredibly tragic as well, and just like incredibly messed up across the board, which I know that George R. R. Martin actually had a role to play in that, where he sort of set up the early like world building for this game, right? And so that might have something to do with it as well. But yeah, I do think it is funny for everything I've said about like really being tied to like story driven games. If you really look at something like Elden Ring, there's actually not a lot of story in there if you don't look for it. You can totally play through that game and not read anything at all. But even so, it still just is able to get its hooks into me. That was actually one of the few games I was able to platinum on PlayStation as well. I typically don't platinum games there, but that was like one of the few that I spent as much time as I possibly could to make sure I got every single achievement for it.
So, what would be your number one pick for a past game, whether that's in the 80s, 90s, maybe even early 2000s? What would that be?
Oh, past game. That's hard. I mean, there's so much out there, and I guess it kind of just changes over time. Um, but I think my contenders are Final Fantasy Tactics, Knights of the Old Republic, and the Mass Effect series. Now, if I were to actually narrow down and choose something from the Mass Effect series, it would probably be Mass Effect 1.
Okay, well, with that being said, then, would you say games now or games back then are better?
Uh, It's hard to say for certain, just because I'm also not fully up to date in the console generation as well. So there's still quite a bit that I am missing. But I will say, just looking at what I do have up until PlayStation 4, and I think I've basically covered 90% of all things PlayStation 4 within that generation. I there a lot of things still weren't able to necessarily get its hooks into me. There was things like Elden Ring, but that was pretty far and few between. I do find myself actually going back quite a bit and playing some of these older games. I mentioned this before, but I do go back to play KOTOR. I play Mass Effect, all the Mass Effect or the mainline Mass Effect series games. We're not going to count Andromeda in that, but I have played through those a couple of times now. I do go back to play Final Fantasy Tactics as well. And I didn't mention this in your initial question earlier, but I would even throw in the Bioshock series. I do go back to that one pretty often as well. But yeah, I have to say, I do think a good portion of my sort of gaming habits are somewhat warped in a sense. There was a period of time where I actually wasn't playing much of anything else besides online first person shooters. And so that was also something that really consumed my time, and I do think has sort of warped my ability to focus on certain things, or has kind of forced me to be a little bit more judicious when I choose different types of games to invest my time into. So,
So, not too long ago, we were all talking about how the game industry maybe is kind of starting to blow up with all the costs getting too out of control and so forth. And I know you right now I have a PlayStation 5, but I know you are still on the PlayStation 4, and I know you've been contemplating a few times back in the past of whether you should or should not get a PS5, and you still have not gotten a PS5. I mean, it's why have you not felt compelled to pick up a PS5?
I mean, I think I just, for whatever reason, this console generation just has not spoken to me in such a way, and so I'm enjoying my time with the Steam Deck. I've actually been going back and playing a lot of indie titles that I have sort of been holding out on for quite some time, or haven't made its way to the PlayStation 4 or any of the other consoles. And so that's really where I kind of feel like investing my time in nowadays.
So I mean, what you're saying to me, I also find a bit interesting because obviously one of the biggest benefits of upgrading, getting a PS5 for example, or even recently a PS5 Pro for example, right? One of the basic clearest examples benefits is getting higher graphical quality, right? Maybe better frame rates, better visuals, more shinier, 4K, 8K maybe for PS5 Pro if you have an 8K screen, which I'm sure is very, very, very few, if any out there. So, to you, does it really matter having the best graphics out there?
No, I don't think so. I think the most important thing is that it just needs to be able to function. You know, I sort of approach poor graphical quality as almost like a interpretation of the art itself, right? Like this was sort of a direction that the developers decided to go into, and for that, I can go ahead and respect that. And of course, some of it was due to limitations, but rarely do I ever critique anything due to its art quality. I do critique things when it is to such a degree that the game is fundamentally broken and that it no longer becomes enjoyable. There are balance issues. There are certain ways that in which you could sort of cheat, essentially. And so with that, that's where I sort of take issue with. And Going back to your previous question as to like why haven't I made the jump to the current generation? I think that that also might play a factor as well. I mean, with a lot of the release cycles now for games, more often than not, day one patches are a pretty common occurrence. There are a lot of issues with some of these newer releases, just like not working right out of the box. And I know that development cycles are pretty stressful. The actual act of developing a game is also a lot of work as well. But I think there is a certain understanding that if a consumer is going to be paying for these things, that they should be able to function and function properly, right? Without that, you're sort of breaking that sort of contract, if you will. And so, with that said, I kind of don't mind just going back and playing some of these old games where things have already been patched, or the expectation is due to certain like technological issues at the time, or like technological limitations at the time, right? And that becomes a little bit more forgiving.
For sure, for sure. I think, and I also want to add on to what you're saying is, for these days, a lot of the visuals are actually all quite good. I mean, even games that are maybe to the higher standard today, that are considered maybe just like okay, are still very very good. And it's not like before. So I remember back in like the 90s to early 2000s, right? For example, you get to a game, right? Like a franchise game, maybe it's a Final Fantasy entry, right? You go from Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy 8. It was a big deal, right? When you saw the visuals from 7 to 8. I mean, it was a big difference, right? You had like more of like a full-blown, more realistic style CGI. Even the characters were more like taller and not like just like blocks like from Final Fantasy 7. Then you went to 9, a lot more details in the arts, even much more like colorful characters. And then when you went from 9 to 10, where you got to the PlayStation 2 era, right, you saw that big jump um, to like the music and like really much more realistic CGI. Back then, I remember being very excited to see a game that looked even more prettier, more beautiful, and more realistic. Now, when I look for a new game to play, I mean, we've already reached a point where a lot of games just all around look good. I mean, and to the point where, I mean, even if a game is considered like on the low end tier of looking good, they still look good, right? So, you know, I kind of feel that we've gone to the point where a game doesn't necessarily have to look any better to being enjoyable. We've gone to a point where we can just focus on, is the game fun? Is the story good? Is the music good? Right? You know, is the art unique? Are the level design unique? Right? So forth. Where we're not really basing it from on graphics and visuals, unless it's a game like maybe it's a Last of Us kind of game or Uncharted kind of game where Naughty Dog for example is trying to push that boundary. But otherwise, even when you read articles, like on IGN or any other type of game review article, I've noticed that I really hear the critiquing on the visuals, like, oh, this game's visual is amazing, and it's getting a lot of brownie points for it. No, it's just like, hey, the game looks good, but that's maybe only like a small percentage of the article, right? Everything else is focused on the gameplay. So from listening to what you're saying, I also get the feeling that the fact that you're playing things on the Steam Deck, you're playing older games, that for you've gone to the point where you're not really consider concerned about the visuals at this point at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, it's definitely that sort of like feedback loop of fun. However, the game is able to achieve that. Um, it's just asking, are the mechanics fun? It is the overall story entertaining or engaging enough, right? Like right now, I'm playing Project Zomboid, which is an indie dev game that released back in like 2013 or something. That game, not visually stunning or anything like that, but the feedback loop on the mechanics incredibly fun. I'm also playing Star Wars: The Old Republic, right? Graphically, not the most appealing thing there either, but the story incredibly well written, super engaging, and just like expanding on a world that I already love.
All right, so we're getting close to the end of the hour, and before I close this interesting interview I've had with Andrew, I do want to ask you what game, what's the one next game you're looking forward to play?
Ooh, um, I know there are a couple things coming out sooner, but honestly, the only thing that is like on the forefront of my mind is Mass Effect 4. They BioWare, they released Dragon Age Veilguard, and it has done pretty well, reviewed very well. But they recently did an interview where they said that there's going to be no DLC for Dragon Age, and they're still going to do some maintenance on it as needed, but everything is going to be shifting towards Mass Effect now. And so after what we got with Andromeda, I am looking forward to seeing where the story is now. From the various teases that we've gotten, this is picking up back in the Milky Way galaxy, following up with what's happening with Shepard and Liara, and just like the cast and crew that we have come to love from the first three games. So yeah, that's probably the thing I'm most excited about. I know it's going to be years out still, but that's really the only thing that I kind of like have on my mind now. And I'm sure that in the meantime, I'll continue to kind of go through this back catalog of things. Wherever possible, I'll try to catch up with any of the current gen games here or there. But I think with how deep Project Zomboid can be, or Swolesor, I think my time will be pretty occupied for quite a while. And plus, we have a couple of other new like online competitive shooters that are coming out soon. I think earlier today there was a little bit of an announcement for like Marvel Rivals, which I'm looking forward to giving a go. I was a little tired of playing Overwatch, but having a spin with Marvel characters, I think could be interesting. There's also things like Deadlock that seem pretty interesting as well. I haven't tried it myself. I know it's technically like free to get early access into it, but I just haven't got around to it myself yet.
All right, so there you have it, people. Mass Effect 4. I admit I am excited for Mass Effect 4 too. I'm actually respectful that BioWare is putting all the resources into Mass Effect 4. I'm hoping that it to be something really big. I know I'm going to be on that game, as I'm sure many of you all are going to be on that game too. Once the first trailer comes out, and once that game, whenever it does come out, comes out. So there you have it. I hope you all enjoyed this little one-on-one with me and Andrew. I hope you all kind of get an idea of what kind of person, what kind of gamer, what kind of mind Andrew has in terms of the world of entertainment and gaming. And we hope you like it. And hey, like and subscribe. Tell us what we're doing good, what we're doing wrong. If you want to do anything more, let us know in the comments. Otherwise, you all have a good time. All right.